Galnet News Digest, 27th of September 3308. We read the news so you don't have to. In this week's news, we look at the Far God cult. They're looking for a new home right now. But where did they come from? What do they believe? And what next for the weirdest religion in the galaxy?
In 3304, with the discovery that the Thargoids had returned still fresh, and with the discovery of the ancient Guardian civilization causing puzzlement, several new religious orders sprang up. The history of previous encounters with aliens had been suppressed for hundreds of years, at least partly by azimuth biochemicals and the Black Flight, but possibly also by those who run the galaxy. So when humanity learned conclusively that we were not alone, it was perhaps natural that beside the more typical reactions of wonder and fear, stuffed down the edges of the Sigma curve, we'd find a small number of people who decided that the aliens were deities and who chose to worship them. Quite a few of the cults, such as Homo Terminus, the Order of Extinction, and, perhaps surprisingly given its later political activities, Nova Imperium, anticipated the imminent destruction of the galaxy with hope. For them, the apocalypse was a treat to look forward to. The Far God cult was one such order. Without any formal name, these Thargoid worshippers believed, and still believe, that the Thargoids are messengers come to bring the sad tidings of the arrival of the really big Thargoid-shaped god called the Far God from another dimension. Only if they believed very hard indeed in the Far God would they be spared when the galaxy is destroyed. Some of the sadly now deceased members of the cult believed that they would turn into Thargoids, black angels to fly in the presence of the Far God. The Far God cult really wasn't much bother to anyone. They set up little hive chapels made of a black coral-like substance, and that smelled of ammonia, and they wore simple black robes, and it seemed that they were just waiting quietly for their end to come.
With some of these new rival religious sects worshipping the Guardians, there were inevitable tensions. Cardinal Hieronymus of the Church of the Eternal Void, a Culture Club classic, explained that his sect offered hope among all the doom-mongers, hope that the Guardians would come back from the dead and fight off the Thargoids. And while everyone was waiting for that to happen, his cult would fight their cult, and the Order of the Far God would be driven out of their hive chapels, off the streets and into a neighbouring galaxy. The weirdness of the Far God cult also earned the distrust and hostility of many ordinary citizens. In the Federation in particular, the populist movement, led by Juanita Bishop, sought to have them rounded up and executed. And it didn't help that people were going missing. Far God cult members and other people were vanishing, leaving no trace. The sense of paranoia against the unresisting Far God cult members grew to almost fever pitch. Government ceased enforcing the freedom of religious expression that had previously been so important. There were riots, and Far God cultists were beaten up. And then, in December 3304, barely 6 months after the unrest about the Far God cult had started, the anthropologist Gether Okonkwo, working with the exotheologian Dr. Alfred Ulyanov, published an exposé. Okonkwo had lived with the Far God people, and he had found out where all those missing people had been going. The Far God cult had built 2 new settlements in Atane, the Prophet on Planet 4A and the Sanctum on Planet 4C. These settlements had vast cryogenic chambers under them, where the Far God believers planned to wait in an icy stasis until the Far God came to dispense justice to the galaxy. In what they seemed to have believed acts of kindness, the cult members had taken along a number of homeless people and a federal spy, all of whom were put into the cryogenic chambers. In a terrible irony, both sides were shortly after attacked by Thargoids, and most of those in the sleep chambers never woke up. Perhaps it's what they would have wanted. Federal agent Nathan Summers was never recovered, but those searching for him found 17-year-old runaway Keona O'Connor alive and reunited her with her parents. In any case, the reason for the disappearance is understood, with the hate speech of the Church of the Eternal Void banned, and with Juanita Bishop's bid for Congress failing, the federal government eventually got a grip and returned to a position where the Far God cult was tolerated. It was, however, never an easy truce.
In 3307, the Far God cult became mysteriously motivated into building 3 new megaships. One, the Testament, would recruit new acolytes. The second, the Perdition, would take all the miserable souls who didn't think they had any chance of surviving the apocalypse on a cruise to meet the Thargoids and their doom. The third, the Sacrosanct, was full of the high-up folk of the cult, the ones who believed that they'd be made into Thargoids when the galaxy came to an end, and would fly forever with the Far God. So it must have come as a bit of a letdown when it turned out they'd been conned by the imperial terrorist group, the Neo-Marlinist Liberation Army, into concealing Master Bombmaker Theta-7. And it must have been even worse when he blew the Sacrosanct up, killing everyone on board.
Following the events in HIP 22460, with Salvation failing to crush the Thargoids, and in fact exactly the opposite happening, the Far God cult didn't win any friends when they celebrated the Thargoids' glorious victory over humanity and prophesied that the Far God will soon become manifest, with the inevitable smiting and apocalyptic outcome. A mysterious new figure, calling herself the first apostle of the true chapter, had established a new sect within a sect on board the Testament. The gloomy fatalists of the Perdition still seem their normal gloomy selves, but the true chapter aboard the Testament have a bit more vim and vigour. Rather than turning the other cheek, the true chapter vowed to fight back against oppression. And rather than live in a federation where they will be oppressed, the first apostle has declared that she is searching for a new homeland for the cult. A place with enough space for all the new converts they're expecting. With tensions once again rising rapidly within the Federation, the Far God cult may have weeks or days to get their people to safety. The Order of the Far God has experienced the kindness of pilots before, when they appealed for Thargoid relics to worship, and when they appealed for help building their megaships. If they make another appeal, perhaps to set up a new colony or to help evacuate their adherents from persecution in the Federation, will you help them?
And that's this week's Far God News. Far God News, we worship the Thargoids, so you don't have to.